Hi everyone, today I wanted to do a response to an article my brother sent me. Now he's a bit younger than myself and he's starting just to get a bit interested in politics, and we were discussing things like socialism and communism, and he found this article which is entitled 10 Reasons Why Communism Sucks. I wanted me to kind of respond to the claims that are made in the article. And I thought, given that I put quite a lot of work into responding to him, I thought I might as well make a video out of it. So, and hopefully, a few of you might also get something out of it. Um, so, first of all, what I wanted to say to kind of preface my remarks is that obviously, as you all know, there's a lot of different schools of thought that fall under the umbrella of socialism or communism, which range from anarchism, which I tend to subscribe to, where you have an abolishment of the state at the same time as the capitalist economic system, to marxism-leninism, which advocates the replacement of the current economic and political systems initially with a dictatorship of the proletariat, where you retain the state, but it's where the workers have control of political power. And following that, the state will then eventually wither away, creating a stateless, classless communist society. And obviously you have other forms of socialism like utopian socialism. But the author of this article doesn't seem to appreciate that. Now, the author of this article seems to lump all forms of communism into one box and ascribe to communism as a whole the faults of the USSR and other similar socialist states. And I don't think that's necessarily fair, given that there's a lot of people who describe themselves as socialists or communists would have very critical opinions of these socialist states. And so I don't think it's fair to say that issues particular to a particular Marxist-Leninist state indicate insurmountable faults with communism in general. But anyway, so the first claim he makes is that communism doesn't value creativity. And first off, I'd just like to highlight the painting that he uses in the article is a painting by Pablo Picasso, who was a member of the Spanish Communist Party for many years. So it's kind of ironic that he's kind of disproving his own hypothesis by showing a communist who was very creative. Anyway, so I'm not quite sure where the author gets the idea that communism doesn't value creativity. But in fact, one of the reasons myself and many others subscribe to socialist viewpoints is that we'd like all members of society to have the time and resources to be able to utilise their creative talents. So the current capitalist system makes workers effectively wage slaves, in that their labour is exploited by capitalists, who are the bosses and the owners of companies. And so workers spend much of their time working in very unpleasant conditions. And they're wage slaves in the sense that if they refuse to work, they won't be able to obtain the things they need to survive, such as food. So basically, they're forced to work. Whereas in a communist system, the means of production, which are things like machinery, tools, natural resources, etc., would be owned cooperatively by the workers, and that would bring an end to the exploitation of their labour. And in a communist system, some of the occupations people currently hold could be completely eliminated, because there'd be no need for advertising, speculation on the stock market, and investors if you don't have private companies for which to carry out these jobs. And also, many jobs can now or will shortly be able to be automated. And with the elimination of all this unnecessary labour, people could have a lot more free time in which to engage in creative pursuits. And in addition to this, I point out that many Marxist and communist historians such as Eric Hobsbawm have examined the links between culture and society, which shows their appreciation for the arts. And finally, there's a huge variety of art that has been influenced by socialism or produced in socialist countries. Just Google socialist music or communist music, and there will be plenty of examples. And the second reason why communism supposedly sucks is the forced collectivization which happened in the Soviet Union between 1928 and 1933. And the author writes, many resisting landowners died at the hands of executioners, and there were some 10 million people who starved to death during this land reform. And he also argues that the same thing happened in China when private farming was outlawed, and he says that about 33 million people starved to death. Now, obviously, there's numerous different accounts of the causes and effects of the famine in the USSR and China, and so I do think a bit of skepticism is required here when we're evaluating the impact of these famines. And as a number of YouTubers have discussed, such as the Finnish Bolshevik, to a certain extent, the effects of the famines may have been exaggerated by capitalist propagandists wishing to depict life under communism as being relentlessly miserable. But in actual fact, life expectancy and total population increased markedly in the USSR and China during Mao Zedong's rule, leading to some to doubt the scale of the famines. Having said that, though, there does still seem to have been a significant loss of life, which is of course deeply regrettable. And I would argue that much of the problem was due to the centralized state bureaucracy that arose within the USSR and China, which basically meant that workers and ordinary people, i.e. not the high-ranking officials, had very little power to alter the running of their societies, meaning that the state machinery was slow to respond to disasters such as famine. And that's why myself and other anarchists advocate a decentralized model of society, where decisions are taken on a collective basis, with the participation of all members of the community, rather than by distant elected or appointed representatives. And clearly I think that people would act to avert disasters as soon as possible if they themselves were to be affected by the disasters, reducing the risk of catastrophes. And finally, it should be noted that famines and disasters are not exclusive to socialist or communist countries. It just seems to be that when disasters occur in communist countries, they're ascribed to faults of communism, whereas if similar disasters which occur in capitalist countries are assumed to be aberrations and not due to capitalism itself. But there are many examples of disasters which have occurred due to the action or inaction of capitalists or feudal lords. So look up the Irish potato famine, the Bhopal disaster, and the countless wars that have been waged in the interests of capitalists, such as the Iraq War, and these have all had huge civilian death tolls. Okay, so the third objection is that supposedly in communist societies you have no rights. And again, I'm not exactly sure where the author gets the idea that citizens of communist society have no rights. But what I would say is that myself and other socialists are motivated by securing and strengthening the rights of working class people, such as workplace rights, the right to free healthcare and education, and the right to a decent standard of living, and that in a communist society these rights would be protected and even strengthened. And indeed, if it hadn't been for the determined efforts of trade unions and socialist groups in opposition to capitalists and elites, we wouldn't enjoy many of the rights we enjoy today. And the author of the article also repeats this libertarian objection to paying taxes and says that redistribution of wealth and property is theft. But I struggle to understand this objection because it seems to me that those who are well off should be prepared to make contributions to ensure the well-being of less fortunate members of society. In fact, I try to practice that myself, even though I'm not hugely wealthy, by helping provide free food to homeless and less affluent people. Otherwise, the alternative seems to be we're left with a society where only those who can afford it are able to have their needs, such as the need to have decent accommodation, food and healthcare met, while less wealthy citizens suffer, which does not sound like a society I would like to live in. So, the next objection is the reduced incentive to work hard that would supposedly exist in a communist society. And actually, if you look at the Communist Manifesto, Marx refutes this idea, so I don't want to dwell too long on this. He says that bourgeois society ought long ago to have gone to the dogs through sheer idleness, for those of its members who work acquire nothing, and those who acquire anything do not work. In other words, if it is true that financial incentives are needed to induce people to work, workers would not bother to work, as the remuneration they receive is pitiful. In comparison, bosses and wealthy capitalists do not undertake so much in the way of hard labour, but they receive huge pay packets. And I believe the solution to this apparent problem is to provide other means that motivate people to work, rather than just purely financial motivations. For instance, if the work's enjoyable and conducted in a pleasant environment, people will likely work more productively. And in my experience at least, many people have a desire to help others. So people may be more willing to work once they know the fruits of their labour will be helping their neighbours, as in a communist society, rather than being siphoned off by capitalists. Finally, as I've stated above, there will be less need for people to work long hours in a communist society due to automation and the elimination of unnecessary fields of work. So there won't be the need for people to labour as much in a communist society, thus reducing the need for incentives. The next objection the author has to communism is what they call militant opposition to imperialism. And by that he argues that the Communist Manifesto advocates the replacement of all governments by communist governments. And he says that the threat isn't merely an internal threat in terms of for monarchies and replacement with communist governments, such in the USSR, etc. But he also goes on to argue that there's the potential that communist countries may invade capitalist countries so as to turn them into communist countries. And he hypothesizes that China might be tempted to invade the US to turn the US into a communist state, which incidentally seems to contradict one of the other points he makes earlier in the article, which is that the US is supposedly a communist state. So, and if that's the case, why would China be so interested in invading the US to spread communism? So these two ideas seem to be mutually incompatible. But anyway, in actual fact, this hypothesis that communist governments would overthrow capitalist ones seems to be contrary to the record of history, and it's actually been capitalist countries seeking to overthrow socialist governments, which has been more common. So if you look at the overthrow of the democratically elected socialist government of Salvador Allende in in Chile by the free market capitalist Augusto Pinochet, who was backed by the US. The US-backed overthrow of Jacobo Arbenz, which was due in part to lobbying by the United Fruit Company after the Arbenz government tried to introduce land reforms, which basically transferred a lot of land from private companies to be commonly owned. And you can also look at things like the Bay of Pigs invasion, where the US attempted to overthrow the Cuban government. So all these events reinforce Lenin's idea that imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism, i.e. imperialism is the means by which capitalism is spread through the globe. And in addition, I'd also argue that militant opposition to imperialism isn't something to be frowned upon, as the author seems to suggest. So imperialism has caused immense misery to a huge proportion of humanity to the benefit of a privileged minority, and is a policy based on violence, either threatened or actualized. For that reason, I believe citizens of a colonized country are entitled to use militant actions to bring about their liberation. And finally, the idea that China would somehow invade the US seems to be beyond the realms of possibility. Obviously, the US is a major nuclear power, and an invasion would surely be suicidal from the point of view of the Chinese, so I can't see that happening. And so the next argument is that communism supposedly has indifference towards the environment, and he highlights the example in the Soviet Union where two important rivers were diverted for irrigation, and this led to the Aral Sea, which those rivers fed, shrinking to about 10% of its original size. And he argues that rather than letting the efficiency of capitalism into its economic model, the Soviet government chose to extract everything it could from the environment without caring one bit about the health of that environment. Now, obviously, the hypocrisy of this argument beggars belief. Capitalism has exacerbated the environmental crises we're currently facing, as it requires continuous growth if it's not to collapse. This in turn requires the constant creation of new markets to exploit, e.g. by using more extractive, environmentally damaging techniques to access resources, e.g. fracking, or by turning new areas of the globe into mines to be plundered from resources. And it's important to highlight here that the issue isn't actions of individual bad capitalists, but the logic of the capitalist system as a whole, as authors like John Bellamy Foster and Fred Magdoff have highlighted, as well as Mexi, one of my friends on YouTube, has explained in a wonderful YouTube video. So, and as a result of climate change, which has been, as I said, greatly exacerbated by the capitalist economic system, scientists predict we're on course for catastrophic climate change, as well as a host of other environmental disasters. And let's not forget the mass extinction event that's currently ongoing, due in part to the hunting of endangered species for financial gain and habitat destruction by agribusiness. And it's true that the USSR has an imperfect environmental record. I believe that was again due to the highly centralised bureaucracy, which left citizens with very limited ability to seek redress of grievances, for instance in relation to environmental concerns. In my view, the answer is again to introduce decentralised, radically democratic forms of decision making, giving people the power to protect their local environments. I believe this would be more likely to yield desirable outcomes for the communities and the planet as a whole, as those living in an area are unlikely to advocate the destruction of their local environment once there's no longer a scarcity of essentials such as food and housing, and as they would suffer the ill effects of pollution and loss of wildlife, etc. And needless to say, letting the efficiency of capitalism ensure the environment is protected is sheer folly, as capitalists care not about the externalized environmental costs of their products, but simply about how much profit they can obtain by selling the products. Okay, so the next objection is the economic calculation problem. So the author writes, the relative success of the free market economy is a real-world refutation of Marxist economics. The latter never has sufficient information on the market prices of commodities and therefore cannot properly ration the distribution of a nation's resources. The only reasonable criticism of the free market economy is the presence of monopolies, which can raise the prices of their products with little fear of reprisal. But monopolies are just like the central control the communist government exercises on its whole economy. A true free market ensures that there be checks and balances on the prices of goods and services. And it's apparent here that the author falls into a common trap. So in economics textbooks, it's often assumed that the tendency of corporations to form cartels is an aberration which is so rare that it can be ignored. But in actual fact, there are numerous examples of this, such as the big six energy companies we have in the UK, and this gives the members of those cartels an effective monopoly, meaning they can raise the prices of their products with little fear of reprisal. And he also asserts that socialist systems cannot properly ration the distribution of a nation's resources, but I believe that criticism would be more accurately applied to capitalism. For instance, we currently, in a world that is largely dominated by capitalist economic systems, we have more than enough food to feed the world, but a surplus of food would make it difficult for capitalists to charge high prices. Hence, they prefer to let food rot or be destroyed, and that's the reason there's still food poverty around the world. In contrast, during World War II, the British government intervened heavily in the market and rationed severely supplies of food, which drastically reduced waste and promoted the reuse and repair of items. And it also seems to have had health benefits for working class people in Britain. So in actual fact, this rationing of food by the central government seems to have increased efficiency and reduced waste, contrary to what the author suggests. And also I should point out that, as Noam Chomsky has pointed out, the idea that capitalist corporations are more efficient than public providers has never been proven. And in actual fact, there's a vast number of waste products from capitalist industries which are simply externalized, meaning there's no need for capitalists to clean up their act. In contrast, in a communist system, which take into account the effects of industries on people's health, the environment, etc., these costs will be internalized. So as community members would have an interest in reducing these negative effects, thus go in some way to eliminating this waste. The third from last objection is that the class struggle is supposedly going nowhere, and the author asserts that the communist state doesn't erase the class struggle, but keeps it going. And he says it does this because it's a government. There must be a group of people in charge, and it's likely that this group enjoys its power. By maintaining their power, the leaders of a communist state separate the population into at least two classes. themselves as the upper class and preferably everyone else in the lower class. It seems to me that here the author seems to misunderstand Marx. Marx posits that there's an intermediary stage to the transition to a communist society. The intermediary is a socialist society, which seems to be what the author's describing here, the dictatorship of the proletariat, where the workers are the ruling class and the bourgeoisie are then the governed class. And that in this society there will obviously be a class divide between the workers and the bosses. However, once the state withers away, a communist society will then emerge, which will be classless and stateless, and therefore it's not the case that communism continues the class struggle ad infinitum. The class struggle will cease once a communist society is achieved. It's just that Marx sees struggle between classes as a primary driver of history, for instance, in the revolutions that erupt due to the conflict between bosses and workers, hence the predominance of the class struggle in Marxist texts. However, what I would say is that it may be that nowadays we might need to reformulate slightly or expand maybe the Marx's concept of class struggle, as it's clear that struggles do not always occur solely between economic classes, but also between genders, races, etc. So what modern governments have proven to be very good at this kind of divide and rule tactic, where they stoke up conflicts between working class people of different races or genders, and kind of playing each other off against each other. So I guess in the more modern light, we kind of need to take these conflicts into account as well. Okay, so the penultimate point that the author makes is the mass murders that supposedly occurred under communism, and he says that communist rule may be directly blamed for the deaths of at least 85 million people. And for this, I feel like I don't have much more to say that hasn't already been said, so I direct you to videos by people like the Finnish Bolshevik again, and leave you to make up your own mind. But also, it shouldn't be ignored that capitalism has killed many millions across the globe, either directly or indirectly. The continuing genocide being committed against indigenous peoples that stand in the way of capitalist developments is, in my opinion, a stain on the world's conscience. And climate change, which threatens to push humanity to the brink of extinction, along with so many other species, some of which have already been eliminated, has been massively accelerated by capitalism. The thing is, once communism has been achieved, it's hard to believe there will continue to be genocides, because once a stateless, classless and moneyless society has been achieved, there will be nothing to be gained in terms of fame or fortune by eliminating opponents. The replacement of nation-states with free federations of communes should also drastically reduce the frequency of wars. So it's not to say that there will be no murders or crime in a communist society, but these will likely be isolated incidents committed by individuals as opposed to the mass killings that have blighted human history. So in other words, if we want to avoid mass murder, we need to move towards a communist society rather than away from one. Finally, the author makes the case that Karl Marx was wrong. He says that Marx's doctrine is fraught with faulty logic, loopholes, and unsolved problems. His idea of economics is based on the labour theory of value. And he says that this is an oversimplification of the market. And he says that Marxist communism has caused the utter collapse of so many national economies. It thinks in broad strokes and fails to tell one subtlety from another. And he says that's because communism is not grounded in reality. Firstly, kind of address the idea that communism has caused the collapse of many economies. I would point out that during the Wall Street crash, when many capitalist economies fell to their knees, that's the US, the Soviet Union, because it was pursuing a radically different economic model, survived relatively unscathed. So it's not the case that communism is always the driver of economic collapse. And also I'd point out that although there may be some elements where Marx might not have got everything right, as is the case for any economist, he was correct to predict the tendency of capitalism to become increasingly globalized and to predict the repeated collapses of increasing severity that have occurred over the last 150 years. And it's also become increasingly clear that capitalism is no longer able to meet the needs of humanity, so it's imperative that work towards an alternative is continued with great urgency. But also what I would say is that there are many others who can make a much better case for the relevance of Marx's work than I can, so I'd encourage you to read them. For instance, authors such as Terry Eagleton and David Harvey have both written excellent evaluations of Marxist legacy in a modern context. And I would also say it's important to note that the case for communism is not merely an economic one. I'd say that it's immoral to wipe out a huge proportion of the Earth's biodiversity and enslave countless human beings. So whatever the economic accuracies or inaccuracies of a particular thinker may be, it's inconceivable on the moral level that business can be allowed to get on as usual. So that brings us to the end of that car crash of an article. I'd be interested to hear what you think of my responses. I hope you find them somewhat helpful, although I'm sure many of us have said similar things to me previously, far more eloquently than I ever could. But yeah, let me know if you've got anything from this, or if you've got any arguments against what I've said, because I'd love to hear them. Speak to you soon.